independence of Peru. One talk in that series, The Magnificent Field of Enterprise, Britons in Peru 1815 to 1915 by Arthur Robinson, laid the ground for tonight's talk, in that it featured the vast coffee plantation established by the Peruvian Corporation in the Selva Central in the 1870s, inspired by a prototype in the British colony of Sri Lanka, then Ceylon. As it happens, our speakers tonight are the direct descendants of Arthur Sinclair, who you see on the screen, the Scottish botanist, soil scientist, and surveyor who had piloted the Ceylonese coffee plantation, a resounding success that earned him in the 1870s the position of surveyor in the Peruvian corporation's immense new concession in the Selva Central, part of the territory of one of Peru's largest Amazonian groups, the Ashaninka, known as Campa by the Spanish descent colonizers, and Chuncho, forest dweller, by their Inca descent highland counterparts. Needless to say, the Ashaninka answer to neither of these irreverent terms, but welcomed the Sinclairs and guided them through their forest territory, now much reduced, but at least under legal title of some of what remains. As we learn from the Sinclairs, these imperial enterprises were on a colossal scale. The British concession in Peru was 500,000 square miles, if I'm correct. While only a fraction of this area was converted to coffee, the lives of the local inhabitants, hunters and gatherers, were thoroughly transformed over decades by the corporation. The current Sinclairs are not known to emulate ancestor Arthur's scientific skills. However, both our speakers share in spades their forebears' talent for exploration and writing. Iain answers to the title of psychogeographer, apparently without flinching, and has written up to a score of popular books on areas of London, such as Hackney, where he lives. Obligingly, Grandfather Arthur had left a remarkable account of his survey of the corporation's concession in tropical lands, recent travels to the sources of the Amazon, the West Indian Islands, and Ceylon. Published in the 1890s, a useful guide for his descendants, and also a good read thanks to the classic reprint series 2018. Farne, Iain's daughter, had grown up with her grandfather's book, which in due course inspired her as a production manager for a documentary film company to conceive and research an expedition in Arthur's footsteps in Peru. In due course, this vision produced her father's acclaimed book, The Gold Machine, as well as the accompanying documentary by their fellow traveler, Grant Gee, that Arthur describes as a fiction based on the real. In the 1870s, the subtropical valley of the Perene was still the preserve of the Ashaninka, powerful and warlike forest dwellers who were reduced to plantation workers for the corporation. Some say as slaves, as indeed in Arana's much crueler rubber enterprise in the Putumayo, also registered on the London Stock Exchange. Yet the Ashaninka survived as an ethnic group to host our speakers in a strategic buffer zone between the Central Andes and their Amazonian territory, as the great forest continually shrinks to plantations of cacao, coffee, and extractive industries such as logging, gold, oil, gas, and cattle. This is Iain's gold machine run out of control. The Sinclairs, Iain and Farne, were inspired by that ancestor's travel book in tropical lands. Reviews of the gold machine have been plentiful and welcoming in Britain and the US. Enjoy the talk. Over to you, Iain and Farne.
Thank you very much. Ours is going to be a divided talk, because what we're talking about, you know, is interesting in a sense of plural time and heritage, and we were talking across the generations, and it was as if my great-grandfather and Farne's great-great-grandfather were in dialogue with both of us, the father and the daughter who was carrying out the serious research. Now, this is a family legend which I grew up with as a child. My father was a general practitioner in a Welsh mining town, as his father had been, his father being Arthur's son, the only one who didn't go into the coffee planting, tea planting business, who didn't go back to Ceylon or Sri Lanka, and who went to Aberdeen University and became a doctor and a traveler. So essentially it was a legend, you know, almost in the Ashaninka style, of a family legend of this ancestor who belonged to a particular place, and where he belonged to was somewhere remote in Peru, something so remote and distant from my Welsh upbringing that I could only imagine it as a kind of adventure written by Conan Doyle, The Lost World, you know, in which this bearded explorer, who I always thought of as a version of my great-great-grandfather, stumbles onto a lost civilization. But when you reread Conan Doyle's book, there's also in it a savage critique of the uglier side of colonialism, the way that in the Amazon, the coffee, not the coffee planters, but the rubber traders were treating the indigenous people, kind of savagery that Casement reported on. So there was a dark underside I was aware of, but essentially as a child, I fixated on the adventure. And as soon as I could, I took out the book, which this is the leather-bound original edition of 1895, which had, apart from photographs of Arthur and the tribal peoples, it had a wonderful pull-out map. You can't see it here, but I studied that map and it became a fixation. And I read the story, but I only saw it in terms of these highlights, that they had to cross the Andes on mules, that they suffered from soroche sickness, that they met some duplicitous priests who were Franciscan missionaries, unnamed by Arthur, who lead them through the jungle to the Salt Mountains, make contact with a single group of the Ashaninka people and persuade them to make balsa rafts, go down to the rapids, at which point everybody disappears. The planters are abandoned, the surveyors are there in this massive and beautiful land, which they describe. And that's basically the childhood story. There were also objects that were returned from Peru, which were in the living room of the house, grave goods, all kinds of strange bits and pieces, very haunting, very extraordinary. So when I took the perverse decision not to become a doctor myself, not to become a general practitioner, go into the family trade, but to go back a stage and to see who was this man, I became obsessed with trying to find him, trying to find what he'd done and to understand his life, because he'd taken the wonderful decision, as well as being a working plantsman and a world traveler, he decided to write. He always made reports. And when I started to read those reports, I recognized elements of my own style of writing. He had a sense of humor. He was always sharp-eyed about the corruptions that were going on, that he was reporting on. He was very satirical about the Catholic priesthood. I suppose he was an old Scottish Calvinist. And what you realize was that however critical we could be about what went on with the colonists themselves, he was himself thrown off his land. His family were poor subsistence farmers from a place called King Edward, a village north of Aberdeen. He left school at the age of 10, and as he says, commenced his education. He was a self-taught gardener and plantsman, a bright boy, spotted by the local aristocrat and shipped off to Ceylon, where, as a very young man, where he then worked until he reached the age of 40, by which time he'd made enough money to retire to Scotland and to become a writer and to become a talker and a lecturer. all his money was lost. There was a terrible series of coffee harvests that were wiped out in Ceylon. All his returns on investment were gone. He made a desperate punt to go to Tasmania, essentially now to see if he could farm there or if he could look for gold. And all of the rest of his money essentially went in that venture. But he wrote, unpublished as a book, an account that's even more savage than what was recorded in Peru about the appalling behavior of the remote landowners in Tasmania, about the destruction of the Aboriginal peoples, about the prison system. And it's a pretty strong critique. And so when we turn it round and begin to look at what happened with the Peruvian corporation, there is that backstory to it. And there's another backstory, is that when he was 13 years old in Scotland, the start of his growing career was that a local farmer gave him a corner patch of a rough field that he got up at 4 a.m. to work on and planted potatoes. And this boy goes out every morning, sort of virtually a barefoot boy, staring at these potatoes as they grow. And then one morning he looks at them and they seem to be covered with soot. The blight is there. It's a part of the Irish potato famine. The same thing has happened in Scotland, less reported. And one of the causes of this apparently could be blamed on Peru, because guano was being shipped back to be used as fertilizer in Ireland in whaling ships that were empty. So the guano from Peru was a contributory element in the blight on the potato harvest in Ireland, which also came to Scotland, and which ended in people being pitched off their land and engaging in these world travels. So that was always my ambition, to follow Arthur's journey in Peru, but that's as far as it went. I had the strange feeling that this very important moment when these men reach the rapids and everybody disappears, abandoning them there, and they're surrounded by the tribal peoples and think themselves about to be slaughtered, that if I could go through those rapids to the other side, if I reached that point, repeating his journey exactly, somehow, in a shamanic sense, I would make contact with this man or some part of his consciousness or the next part of the story. So for me, I was recreating his version of an adventure story, as I'd already done, as was mentioned in the introduction, in journeys where I'd be hacking my way down the Thames estuary or around the M25 motorway with the mindset of the explorer, behaving like Arthur himself, but in a much more domesticated version. And so that was my take. But then it was infinitely and indefinitely postponed until Farne, who had made her own engagement with her great-great-great-grandfather by coming down to stay in Wales in her grandfather's house as a young child, after having had an operation and needing to recover. She spent time down there, made contact with this book, and heard the stories of my grandfather in the same way that the Ashaninka people passed on stories verbally. That's how the legends passed on. So the same thing happened with us. And Farne took up this story and undertook real research into the Peruvian corporation. She found the original contract that Arthur had signed. And what fascinated me was this happened exactly at the moment that Joseph Conrad in Brussels got his contract to go onto the Congo. Arthur was in the Leadenhall Street in the city of London, where he went to the Peruvian corporation and got a contract to go and make this expedition, being paid by the month on the understanding that he might not come back. So the money was coming in every month they survived. It was like an old man's punt. He was into his 60s, which was then registered as pretty old. He traveled with 2 other people, another planter from Ceylon called Alexander Ross, and a representative of Kew Gardens called Clark. What we now understand is that Kew Gardens was an agency of the state. Kew Gardens was paying people to essentially pirate crops from places that were not part of the British Empire and ship them into the British Empire. When Arthur was in Ceylon and he was sick, he discovered a cinchona, which had been stolen from Peru, being planted in the botanical gardens. So I'll pass you on to Farne, because the next part of the story and what she really wanted to uncover was this history of the Peruvian corporation, and to take it back and make some kind of restitution to the Ashaninka people, and also to find out more about how they live now and what was the aftermath of these huge enclosures that were the coffee estates. Farne.
Thank you. So I was just, thinking about the relationship that England, the UK has with Peru, and it is a sort of secret history in a way, or a forgotten history. So even though there was a period of time where Britain was running Peru's railways, and Peru, as I'm sure you probably know the history, because Peru was in debt with 50 million pounds, and had been bankrupted by the war with Chile, they did a deal with the British Peruvian Corporation for them to run their railways, and part of the deal was giving them this huge amount of land. And I feel like what most people think about in Britain when they think about Peru might be Paddington Bear, or they have a very sort of affectionate sort of image of Peru. And I think there's kind of forgotten sort of cultural memory of Britain's relationship with Peru. One of the things that was interesting about doing this project was that we did it in 3 different ways. So Iain ended up writing The Gold Machine, and Grant G made a film, and I ended up making a series of podcasts, which is called In Tropical Lands, after Arthur's book. Had never made a series of podcasts before, so it was all very new to me. Just made recordings with Iain, our conversations, what was going on. And what was interesting about it, again, I think, is that, it was all recording an oral history, and that enabled us to record firsthand from the Ashaninka people there, some of their stories, try and capture the Ashaninka language, of which there's only 300 speakers left in this particular region. So that was an important thing for me to do. And some of the things that emerged about that tribal history was almost sort of a year later, when I was listening back to them in detail. And I was still picking up things that people were telling me or had told me at the time that might have got lost in that moment of translating between Spanish and Ashaninka. So it felt like we were capturing important histories. So yeah, so that was part of the mission, was to try and hear the side of the story from the point of the Ashaninka, which is quite a daunting thing to do, because you're kind of you're there as a descendant of somebody who was working for the Peruvian Corporation. When we went there, we didn't know the full extent of how the Ashaninka people had been co-opted into working, and how brutal that had been. So listening to some of those histories was quite upsetting. But on the other hand, and I was just kind of re-listening to some of the recordings that I had done, actually, because it is a while ago now, so to remind myself. But there was a history that emerged of how they took control back, and there was an important Ashaninka leader, Mashari, who went with his son to Lima and demanded that their land be given back to them. So they were taking control over their own destiny. So it's not just a story of their land being taken from them, but also them regaining their land. So that was something that was important to do. And I think we also realized just kind of what land ownership means in Peru. It's kind of quite a complicated process, partly with our guide Lucio, who's an Andean, who we couldn't have done it without. He had a long history of his father working with indigenous people and him traveling and staying with them, and he kind of gave us a lot of access to them. We sort of realized that in Peru you only ever own the land that's literally under your feet, and the government own everything else, just in case there's any gold that emerges, so they can claim that back. And it isn't as simple as owning land. There could be, you could have thousands of acres of land, but if you can't protect it, or you can't, map it out, then it's not your land. So it's not a straightforward thing at all. Yeah, so that was some of the things that I wanted to say. Yeah.
What it's interesting, Farne introduces one of the themes of the book, which is gold, which was a sort of a metaphor, really, because in the end, as we discovered, the real gold was green gold, it was coffee. But on the very first day that we stayed in an Ashaninka village on the banks of the Perene, I got up as I would do if I was in Hackney, because it takes a long time to shake Hackney off. And I did a little walk along the banks of the river and to the edge of the jungle and came back. And there was nobody in sight. It was early. The chickens were out, but the villagers were not visible. But I knew they were watching me. And after I'd finished and gone back into my hut, a couple of the elders came to talk to Lucio, our guide, and they said, "Was the old man looking for gold?" Because I was poking about on the beach. And indeed, Lucio, as Farne has mentioned, this Andean man from Huancayo, who's quite a successful businessman, hustler, a great apostle of adventure tourism, also was a storyteller. And one of the elements that was very hard for Grant G to do in the film was to give reasonable representation to Lucio's stories, because there's no way to cut them. Once they'd begun, they went on and on and on, became ever more elaborate, a lot of them featuring his father. But one of them was also about gold, because what happened was that the people there in the village had thought they'd found some gold dust and gave him a file of gold dust to take to Lima to be assayed. And he didn't want to do it because he knew that if it actually was gold, it would be ruin for the village, because the dredgers would be in, the river would be even more polluted. The river was now dead. But he took it, he had to take it, it was an obligation. And he was with one of his adventure tour groups. And he noticed, oh my God, I've lost it, I've left it in a hotel. So they went back to the last hotel where they'd stayed. And he called for one of the servants to come up to see him. And he produced a big knife. And of course, the boy ran out. Lucio was arrested and thrown into prison, and the whole thing turned into a major disaster. So every time you went near gold, there was some sort of disaster. Among the actual Ashaninka people ourselves in the village we stayed, Grant had this feeling too, and I'm sure Farne did, is that the village where we were was a sort of tourist performance space. It was real in the sense that the people living there were real, but they had to put on ceremonies for tourists, mostly Peruvians, no Europeans, I think, were there to come and see them. And once they'd all gone in the evening, then the real village came to life. And these were shacks and shanties up on a hill behind the created village. So in the evening, Farne wanted to make an interview with one of the witnesses, an elderly tribal woman who was in fact the mother of the village chief and who had been interviewed by the anthropologist Elena Mijas. And this was a lady called Bertha. And we found her hut. She was reluctant to talk, but in the end, she made a little fire and we sat round outside, and she explained that the old gods were fire and stone, and that the Seventh-day Adventists had come, and the legend behind it all was a legend of gold, that there was the idea that this Redeemer, Juan Santos Atahualpa, had come through and had been leading resistance against the government and against the oppressors. And when he died, he was in a cave where he was buried on layers of gold. And the stories of this cave and of Juan Santos Atahualpa were different every time they were told by different people. But we went to the village that was closest to this, which was also near one of the coffee colonies, and went through the ritual of an elaborately prepared meal and exchange of gifts. And we showed photographs that Arthur had taken that looked very similar to the tribal peoples who are there now. And Farne gave the contract, and so we were in good faith, and they said they would take us to this cave. And of course, it was a fantastic expedition, followed for miles along trails, and we're taken to the jungle, and the chief ran out ahead of us in his flip-flops. We couldn't keep up with him, and he just disappeared into the jungle. So we were just left there in the middle of this silence, which was absolutely wonderful. You know, the light was pouring in through the palm fronds. We couldn't move. It was warm. It was wet. It was incredibly calm and still. And in a sense, that was the gold. You know, he performed a trick. We weren't going to see the cave. That was a secret. We were left to understand what the ground was and how rich it was. And thereafter, when he returned, he took us to one of the remnants of a coffee plantation and a gigantic stone pyramid, which was a memorial to Fernando Stahl, who was the missionary that came in with the Seventh-day Adventists. And Farne's research had also proved the fact that the Seventh-day Adventists, who they had recognized as sort of saviors in some senses, because they set up hospitals and schools, but they only treated people who belonged to the coffee colony. And they had done a deal with the Peruvian corporation that the missionaries would be allowed in on the understanding that they would tame the natives, make them give up taking ayahuasca, make them stop having drunken binges. They would work. And of course, the churches are now established. So to actually hear these stories that we brought back was of some use. And the final payoff of it all was when we went to the last really surviving and quite thriving coffee colony, which was now run by a cooperative because the coffee colonies were taken away from the Peruvian corporation at a certain point. And after a tour of this and understanding how the beans were grown on the hill, put down chutes, went through a whole lot of processing, some of it looking very primitive, some of it with huge machines. Then we had a lunch and they took us on a tour and led us into a room, a locked room behind bars, in which there was a huge archive of paper, which were the records of the coffee colony and the Peruvian corporation. Sacks and sacks and sacks and sacks. Every single bill that had ever been paid, every letter sent backwards and forwards from the coffee colony, from useless English younger sons who'd been sent out there and didn't have the faintest clue about any kind of botanical studies or what to do. All of that stuff, maps, drawings, books, all of it was there, all being eaten away. And it was like a monstrous history that we would never be able to tap, but which we could see. And the other final thing was to have an expedition on the river itself, on the Perene. Farne and I, one evening, I think identified it, Uranaki was the exact spot where Arthur took to the river in his balsa rafts. And he'd had to wait a long time for the rafts to be made and the chief of the local tribal group to recover from he had some sort of flu or illness, and he recovered and they took to the water. And so we needed to repeat that journey. But one of the underlying tensions in our expedition was that Lucho, who was a phenomenal source of energy and information and contacts, was also determined that we should undergo this sort of process, guerrilla treatment of adventure tourism. So he endlessly wanted us to go to waterfalls, climb up waterfalls, see sort of tourist sites, see some llamas and look at sheds where weaving was going on. This is all interesting, but we needed to stick to the map and the journey because time was limited. Arthur was there for nearly a year. We were there for just under a month. And so there was a sort of to and fro with Arthur. And the other aspect was that there was that prejudice. He couldn't be quite sure why Farne was in charge of the money and all the organization. And so that battle had to be established. And when it was established, the women in the group were incredibly impressed that a woman seemed to be in charge of our group and was running things and producing the money. And so they provided a wonderful breakfast on Farne's birthday. They, instead of the usual yucca roots, they produced a plate of fruit. And the ultimate was they brought out a cup of coffee. They don't touch coffee. They hate coffee. Coffee is the curse, coffee is the karma. And they brought it. They were so impressed with us. So this was a great moment. And, it was a moment when we exchanged gifts. And I think we left on good terms. Because now, even the people we visited are in hock to tourism. The Grant G's film starts with a very funny moment in an interview in which the chief man of Pampamishi, which was the first of the colonies that we went to, speaks about if we pay him a certain fee, he'll tell us the story of how awful the Peruvian corporation was. If we give him a bit more, he'll go on for half an hour. And we're sort of negotiating these fees to tell the stories. And when that was finished, he says, I want you to go out and raise money for me because I want to build a big tourist center. I want a tourist place where we can have performances and so on and so on. So they were actually driving the engine of this kind of tourism, which was also making them into a performance and a parody of themselves. So it was very complicated. And then COVID hit. And suddenly they were locked down. And Grant G, the filmmaker, had a Zoom conversation like this with the shaman of the village who grew ayahuasca and who went out looking for plants in the forest. And he said he had a cure for COVID. He'd found plants and he'd got the right water and everything. But some of the older people that we had interviewed had died. And the village was completely cut off. There was no access to it anymore. And the police were having roadblocks. So they had gone back to the old ways. They'd started to grow stuff again. They'd started to fish. They'd started to do all the things that they, to some extent, stopped doing because they relied on tourism. So there was a sort of something of an upbeat at the end of that message. It was I don't think any of the obvious black and white reactions of how you think about the enclosures and the colonies and the tourism is ever quite as straightforward as it appears. So at least all we've learned by undertaking this journey is how rich it is, what a wonderful country, what complex arguments, rows, wars, enclosures, dramas have been there. The figure that Arthur doesn't name at all, the Franciscan missionary, was a man called Padre Sala, and he was actually, when you research him, one of the most important figures in the area because he was one of the few who knew or claimed to know all the jungle paths. He led all the expeditions that came. In 1891, there were 3 expeditions. Before that, it was pretty much untapped territory. And there was a military survey that followed on Arthur's expedition. And Padre Sala was the one who led them all. He drew some absolutely beautiful maps with little pictures of the various convents and of the villages that he visited. And he became the chief abbot of the main Franciscan convent where we saw the library and saw his work. But Arthur didn't name him because when he arrived at the small convent where he was disturbed by the atmosphere. And what there was another side to it, that Sala was rounding up children, Ashaninka children, some of whom had been accused of witchcraft, but was bringing them all in and making them into sort of Catholic converts, and was being paid per head for those he rounded up. And he went around with heavily armed with guns and dynamite. And he taught the Ashaninka to fish with dynamite. They were very impressed. He threw a stick of dynamite in, and that suddenly all these fish were floating on the surface. So he was himself an extraordinary character, and an important one. And Arthur doesn't name him. But there were 3 people on Arthur's expedition. Alexander Ross, who was almost a rival of Arthur's. They were doing the same thing. And Clark, who was more mysterious and was reporting back to the Kew authorities. And I thought that our expedition was almost like a kind of mirror image of this that came later, in that Farne and I were telling our own stories in different ways, 2 different narratives. And Grant G, who was the filmmaker, was mysterious. He wasn't telling us what he was doing. He was watching us, and he was coming back with a different story himself. So I think these cycles of history repeat themselves. And what we discovered was that time is also a complex thing there. Linear time arrived with Arthur and the colonists. I mean, he had the time to make a long, slow journey, which he describes in his book, whereas we flew straight into Lima, which is ridiculous because your soul is left behind. The Ashaninka people had a much more plural sense of time. They had a sense of time in which past and future all coexisted with the geography. And if you wanted to find your ancestor, you go to a particular location and you make a journey and think about him. And when you get there, you will make a contact, a psychic contact with him. You will sit and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to come into that sense of time as against our day-to-day linear time. And so we learnt stuff. I think they learnt something of their own history.
We did. I was going to say that was interesting. Some of the insights that they were able to give us about Arthur. We were able to show photographs that Arthur had taken, and they were able to tell us what the tribal markings meant. Like if there were 3 marks on a woman's face, it meant that she had been widowed. And they were also able to give us some insight into the story of what happened at the end at the rapids, when there'd been a kind of standoff one night, and Ross and Arthur and Clark had been kind of confronted by a war dance, and they never really knew why. And Osvaldo Rodriguez, who was the chief in Marinchiari, said, well, that point of the river, we call it the whirlpool of death. And if you go beyond that point of the river, you'll get sucked down into the whirlpool of death. So he was able to tell us that even over 100 years later, what that geographical point of the river was about, and that actually the dance and the show that was being done was probably a warning to Arthur rather than a threat. So there was still things that you could learn in that dialogue.
Yeah, and also now the contemporary moment, this whirlpool of dead ancestors, as it was called. When we were trying to find it, a woman who had a tiny little shop alongside the river bank there at the final point, sold us some dried out biscuits. And when you buy a packet of biscuits, they'll give you huge bunches of bananas free because there's nothing you can do with them. She said, don't go any further. This taboo was still there. Don't go any further. You cannot go. You cannot go by river. And if you try and cut through by land, you're not going to make it. This is unspecified danger. And it appears that the territory beyond is now narco-traffickers, some remnants of Shining Path, whatever. It is a dangerous place. You don't go there. So the sort of ghosts of the period when Arthur was there in the 1890s have translated into the contemporary world, and the taboos are still present. And we never did make it because the boatman who'd agreed to take us never turned up. Lucho was sort of bored with it. He tried to take us to waterfalls. But we did find a boy with a dugout canoe who for 2 soles would take us out on the river towards the rapids. So in turn we went, and I sort of persuaded him into the very first of the rapids, but then he said, if you don't stop now, you can't come back. I thought, well, that wouldn't be too good. So we did come back, and we basically did the same as Arthur. We also kind of encountered the salt mountain, which was very important for the tribal peoples in terms of the journey that was made to collect the salt, the vital need of the salt. So it was a sort of sacred place. Farne and I were discussing the salt mountain, whether the whole mountain was salt or whether it was a single point which they went to, and it seemed the whole mountain actually was salt, but there were single points that you could go to and collect salt. So we kind of crammed it in, you know. We learned an awful lot in a very short time, and hopefully the three different accounts play up three different narratives that will give other people a sense of what the story was.
There's quite a lot to it, all the different strands.
I think we probably used up our time.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a remarkable account, a remarkable journey. I don't see yet any questions here, but this doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't written any, but if you please do, and then I will read them out as they come up. Meanwhile, Farne, I wanted to start off with a question for you. There can't be many producers who make films that include their father in a lead role, let alone in the Amazon. What hilarious moments or challenges did it present?
I
wasn't in the film.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the film part of it is more Grant G, and when we were there, he was filming, but in a very kind of documentary way that you weren't really aware of. I think in terms of doing a creative project with Iain, that was a very valuable experience to me, and it's sort of something that I wanted to do for a long time. I think before it started, in a way, I was quite daunted, because I think I was kind of looking forward to it, but it's also that we hadn't spent so much time together. It's like 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks to spend together, which is a real gift. But yeah, I think it was very important to me to undertake as a creative project. But,
yeah. And you, yes, how did you feel about it?
I'll explain a little bit about Grant G's film. Is that Grant G wanted to make a film with me way back when he just stopped being a student in Oxford in the I nearly said the 1890s, in the 1990s.
Time is overlapping.
We couldn't get the funding for that, and this eventually happened, but he actually wasn't really making a film initially about the gold machine, but about an earlier book I'd done called Dining on Stones, which was in 2004. And what that book was about was like a person, a writer, a blocked writer, who is in a flat in a strange building in Hastings, who is looking at his great-grandfather's book, and I was using the real book. So he's using that book to try and conjure up a story that's going to allow him to continue writing. And he's going to write the book that becomes the gold machine, essentially. But that's way in the future. So Grant's film was really a fictional account of a writer played by an actor who's in this flat in Hastings, who is using his daughter's research, which is the documentary footage, to create a kind of fabulous version of the story, which is neither the book that I wrote or the podcast that Farne made. So Farne appears in the film. I don't. I'm played by an actor, or the fictional character is played by an actor and voiced by another actor. And I wrote the voiceover for this actor. So I'm writing a kind of fictional voiceover using this material. So the film is a kind of different posthumous construct. Grant G always wanted to go back the following year to use the initial research just to discover which bits he wanted to film properly, you know, with a crew. But of course, he couldn't go back because COVID came down. So all there was the documentary footage of our journey. And he assembled a very interesting film from that material, using the actor and using interviews with all kinds of people, like Governor of the Bank of England talking about the Peruvian corporation. So there's a lot of material in there, which we didn't have at the time we made our journey.
Well, thanks for that. There's a lesson there for us, I think, is to, it'd be great to have links for the Anglo-Peruvian Society, for our membership, to get hold of how to get hold of your podcasts, Farne, how that's done. Maybe they know it already, but if they
well,
don't,
anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts.
Is that it? It's just there's something simple. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
The film you can get. There's a screen server called Mubi, M-U-B-I, and if you go onto Mubi, it should be available for a year on that screen server.
Okay. All right. Well, that's something that we should share with our membership and make sure that we get to see that. Something that's right. I've worried about the book. It has a lot of about the north of Peru, as well as the central part. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to ask you about. How come two British enterprises, both registered more or less at the same time in the London Stock Exchange, could have had such different approaches and attitudes to governance and care of the local workforce? Do you think that Arthur's painstaking survey, now you tell us it was a year, that's pretty painstaking, and his blueprint for the coffee plantation contributed to the relatively benign regime in the Perene? And I think you'll realize I'm talking about in comparison with the Putumayo and that very different.
I'd like to think it did, but I don't know. I think because everything that he did was way ahead of the actual plantations being set up.
Right.
They were just using his planter's eye to say, is this good land? So essentially, these men were there identifying territory which nobody seemed to have much interest in, apart from the native people who lived there and who were going to suffer the after effect of this. And the worst aspect of it was that he considered that they had had the use of this land for generations, and in the Scottish Calvinist sense, had not made anything of it. In fact, they didn't need to make anything of it because it and they were one thing. They moved through it and they lived there. So essentially, his philosophy had a devastating effect in the future. But at the time, he was not responsible for any kind of setting up of colonies. He was just saying this is a good place. Yeah. Although subsequently, when he came back, he took on a sort of PR role of going to Australia and New Zealand and trying to sell this idea. So he was out there talking up his adventure story and saying, this is a great place, let's go there. He was very keen that the labor force should be Chinese. He liked Chinese people very much, and he was always going on about how strong their family life was as against the behavior of some of the Spaniards he'd come across. He was actually written up in the Melbourne paper when he was in Australia because he defended a Chinese man who was being attacked and kicked out of the way by a rude Australian. So they thought this was extraordinary that someone should bother to do this. And yet the consequences were that the people we talked to were still very much damaged by the fact of this enforced colonization, this setup, because you could only get the medical attention and the schooling and anything else by being a member of the workforce. And there were barriers around it. And there were range wars between the various coffee colonies, that the bosses used the native warriors to fight and kill. In fact, the head men of each of these colonies were killed in kind of wars that were like the Wild West. So it was a pretty brutal period followed.
Yeah.
And running right up to the 1940s. I mean, one of the people, several of the people we interviewed had actually worked on the colony in their extreme youth, and they'd been regularly beaten, and they were forced laborers. It wasn't anything like what happened in other places.
Right.
But it was pretty brutal.
Yes. How you do mention towards the end of the book, you do mention that the Putumayo and what happened there. I'm just wondering, was it in your book that I read that Joseph Conrad didn't sign the petition for clemency of Roger Casement?
It was in my book, yeah.
It was in your book. I thought so.
It is in my book, yes. That I do write about that. Because
that's the most extraordinary thing, isn't it?
Well, the reason that Conrad met and admired Casement in the Congo and thought he was extraordinary, and they corresponded, and so it was assumed, obviously, that he would sign the petition and defend him when his life was in danger. He didn't, because he felt himself to be a Polish person in England, that his own status would be it was maybe a cowardly thing to do, but he didn't want his own status endangered by supporting supposedly an Irish traitor, kind of to the British regime. And that was, I mean, it's a mark against him, but this is what happened. And I mean, that's the reason he didn't do it. Other writers did.
Yes, I can imagine. And it's a shame. I mean, the Putumayo, the whole business was closed down within about 6 years, and he was hanged, of course, in quite soon after. But
and he has some remarkable photographs. There's a big collection of the photographs that Casement took in Dublin, and I've got some of them in the book. One of the great losses of this expedition was a lot of the photographs that were taken on glass negatives were lost when the mule was carrying all these photographs, crossing one of these very rickety vine bridges, tumbled, 2 of them were on it, fell into the water and was drowned, and all of these photographs were lost. So when Alexander Ross came back, he gave a talk to the Royal Geographical Society in London. They had to borrow images to show, because all of his had been lost. A lot of Arthur's survived, and the camera he used was still in the family. And when I was first living in London and I met the next Arthur, who was the son of the son, he said, well, I'm going to give you this camera. When I'm gone, it's your camera and you can have Arthur's camera. And I think it's still got some film in it. So that was something that haunted me forever. When he did die, and his widow said, yes, you must have this camera, but it never actually came. And then she suddenly got ill and died herself, and all of that vanished. So it's I'm haunted by the idea in some junk shop somewhere, this camera of Arthur's will turn up, and there'll still be some images to find.
Don't worry, Iain. Somebody will watch your film, and then they will make contact with you, no doubt.
I hope so.
Well, do we have any? Has anybody got any questions to ask? I've been hogging this to some extent. Are there any questions from us? And
Hi.
hello,
Hi.
yes, yes.
Now, I just wanted to say that we will be following the talk with an email, and you will receive a copy of the recording of this session. We will also be sharing how you could get in contact with the speakers and their publications.
Oh, good.
I hope you enjoyed this session. So I will show the photos now.
Okay. So these are the ones, yes, the photographs that you put. Yeah. Okay, good.
You have started screen share.
Shimmy, shimmy.
Ah, Farne.
That's me. Race through the slides. That's a Lucius
breakfast.
farm. Madre Sala.
La Arroya we didn't talk about, which
Oh,
we
yeah,
is a,
which is a mining centre, the
absolutely
most
horrendous.
polluted place on earth.
the railway was just being built when Arthur came.
Mhm. And this character?
This was part of the festival that was going on when we got
Okay.
there. Yeah.
They're parody of the colonists in that there's a kind of a man in a white face whipping the people wearing black faces. This is just some of the gold in the cathedral in Lima.
That's Grant.
That's Grant.
Documentary.
The background of money. Again, Lima's gold.
Rosalie talked to everyone. This is a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Rosa. Oh, thank you, Rosa. Indeed. Are there any more? Or is that it for the pictures? Oh, yes, here we are.
It's the same ones, isn't it?
They're the same ones. Okay.
This was the. Oh, well, go on.
All right. Okay. No, good.
That's our lunch.
Oh, yes.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. Paula's, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you indeed. Let's just make sure there's no extra question here. No. Well, indeed, thank you so much for this talk. Fascinating talk. And the book, I haven't finished it yet, but I have enjoyed it hugely, and I encourage members of the Anglo-Peruvian Society to get your copy. And when you find out how to get the films, let me know, please, because that will. I'm much easier with books, but less with those. The book, I must say, is staggeringly interesting as you go through it. Really extraordinary, as indeed the newspapers have said. So congratulations, Iain, for that. A great success, and congratulations, Farne. I haven't seen your work, but on the film work, but I bet that's great too. And congratulations for managing to produce in the Cerro Central, in quite an isolated path along the Perene, to keep your team in order.
Yeah, well, I'm very grateful that we went when we did, because it was just before COVID. And if we hadn't gone then, it just wouldn't have happened in the same way. And people we interviewed have since passed on, so we're lucky enough to get the kind of final meetings and recordings with them. So yeah, it was just very lucky that we went when we did.
Congratulations, and thank you very much indeed on behalf of the Anglo-Peruvian Society for giving us this insight into extraordinary